Welcome to the show. Today we're talking about virtual property tours, the future of real estate. Did this pandemic that we're currently sitting in maybe exacerbate the entire process? We were moving to a technology world as it was, but is this our new normal? I've got a great guest on the show today. His name is John Fagan. He's the CEO and co-founder of Doorkee, multifamily expert who lives in New York City, spent his whole life in New York City, born and raised. And he has really put together something really fantastic in the virtual space, and his expertise is really around property technology and multifamily. So we're going to have a conversation today with John about what the future of real estate looks like. Everyone turning to their laptops, their computers to do house buying now and virtual tours before they even rent an apartment. John, good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, Clayton, thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, thanks so much for being here. So you're in New York City right now. We're right now knee deep in this pandemic. So my old stomping ground, I used to live on the Upper West Side in Manhattan and worked in Midtown. You are in, I guess, Greenwich Village. Tell us what the city looks like right now, and being a real estate investor in this space, how has this changed everything for you?
Yeah, so I mean, in short, things have changed dramatically from the day-to-day experience all the way to the macro environment. So I have my dog Scout, who I just introduced you to
Yeah.
right before we started the show. Him and I, we go on a lot of long walks. He keeps me and my girlfriend Lacey sane. And when I'm out at night, I may come across three, four, five dog walkers, and that may be it in the entirety of basically the heart of New York City. I live right south of Union Square, and so seeing the city that I've loved and I've grown up in, and I went to school in, and I went to law school in, and got my first job in, it's really hard to really wrap your mind around just how much this pandemic has devastated New Yorkers. Now, obviously, we've gone through tragedy before, but this is a different circumstance because this is not a one time consequence that we're dealing with indefinitely. It's an ongoing, unforeseen, and poorly handled pandemic that unfortunately is going to have a lot of negative unintended consequences for a very long time. And I think what's toughest to deal with is the fact that it's unforeseen. No one really knows when this is going to end or how different our lives actually will be when we have to put in place permanent mechanisms of coping.
Well, we've already seen New York transition. I mean, they've made it through incredibly difficult times in the past, pandemics before, massive heat waves, blackouts, 9/11 attacks, terrorist attacks. The country, America always bounces back. New York City, particularly, always bounces back. But it will change, and you're seeing right now New York City making a rapid transition from the sort of traditional renting process. So let's talk about this, because when I lived in New York City, you would call up a broker, really. And it was a really weird thing. I remember
Yeah.
this was my first
Yeah.
experience with this. I lived all over the United States, from Montana to West Virginia to Ohio to California. I never called a broker to find me an apartment and then pay a broker's fee to find me a property. I'm like, why can't I just go to the internet
Mhm.
and find something? Well, that's all changing now, right?
That's right, Clayton. And this actually started from a personal experience that I had had about 2.5 years ago. I was living in an apartment in Williamsburg that I loved. It was spacious, it was inexpensive, which is incredibly rare for people who know Williamsburg, at least recently. And I knew that my lease was up in December and I had to move. And so I wanted to find my apartment to move in December, but start beginning to search in August. And then I realized that that's not something you can do. You can't find your apartment that far in advance. And so I was kind of disappointed about it, but I was going to move in with a good friend of mine, and we started looking for apartments ourselves. And we started looking online, and we found our apartment. And then we thought, Scout, sorry,
That's
very
right.
sorry.
He likes the apartment.
He's all riled. He loves this apartment. He's going to be very disappointed when we move at the end of the month. We actually bought a house in Williamsburg. Sorry for Scout interrupting. So we were looking for this apartment, and we hadn't called a broker. We just found our apartment online, and somehow the apartment we went to go see was being brokered by the landlord's broker. I had mentioned that I was going to see in another apartment, and that broker just showed up to that apartment without really me asking for it. And so it was a little bit of an uncomfortable situation. So I show up, all of a sudden I have a broker that I didn't ask for, The landlord now has a broker in this new apartment that I show up to. They key me into the apartment that I found. They chat for a bit about industry stuff. And then I take a tour of the apartment. I take a video. I send the video to my best friend who we're going to move in together with. There's this amazing balcony. There's this exposed hanging staircase, and we love it. The only problem is we're now responsible for paying not one, but two broker fees. So the broker that jumped onto my search somehow wanted $4,000. The broker for the landlord wanted $4,000. And I'm sitting here saying, I did all of this research myself. All you guys did was key me into the apartment. This is insanity. So we ended up losing the apartment because we couldn't justify the apartment. And so then I felt this process is so broken. There is absolutely no reason at this juncture that we have to be dealing with brokers. We have to have this sort of broken process that's very manual, where I have to send my sensitive information, like a picture of my passport and my W-2s and my social security number, to a complete stranger over email. And so I started thinking to myself, if I'm in this position where it's August and I know I want to move in December, surely there are other renters out there like me who are in the exact same position. Why don't we just connect all the renters so that we can start looking for our apartment further in advance of a move out? We could do it without paying a broker fee, and we could do it on a platform that allows end-to-end transactions. So that means I could search, I could message, I can get my background check, I could do my lease signing, I could do my fund transfer. Why not just make this a 21st century experience when everything else in the world at least has caught up to the 20th century, whereas renting is still stuck in the 19th century?
Right. So then that's the premise behind Doorkee, right? It's by putting, it's by putting these people together. Now, how do the brokers feel about all this? I mean, look, what shifted, because something major shifted in New York City just a short time ago, well, with the brokers' fees anyway, right?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of changes here in New York City. So you're right that New York is its own idiosyncratic rental marketplace, and it's brokers still exist outside of New York City, but I would say that brokers have a huge chunk of the apartment rentals in New York in a way that they don't have that market share in a lot of the other major markets, with the exception of maybe Boston and Chicago both have brokers. But the difference here is that in New York, oftentimes it may be the apartment seeker instead of the landlord that pays the broker fee. Now, last summer, the New York State had passed legislation protecting tenants, doing things like maxing out at $20 how much you can charge for an application or a background check fee. They also put some pretty strict laws on being able to raise the rent. And obviously, there's a big uproar in the real estate community in New York City because it felt a bit ham-fisted, and it didn't feel as if the laws that were passed reflected reality. Now, one of the outflows of this is most recently the New York State Department of State issued guidance based on that legislation that said that one of the clauses that they're interpreting would mean that if a landlord engages a broker to purvey his or her apartment, they cannot pass off that brokerage fee to the tenant. And so from our perspective, we think that that's perfectly fair. This is not something that the tenant wanted or necessarily needed. And if they didn't bring their own broker, they shouldn't be responsible for a broker fee. And so in my situation that I just described, I still would have been stuck with the broker that I brought, but I wouldn't have had to pay the broker fee that the landlord hired. Now, that is on pause as of now, as of April 21st, 2020. And that's going, I believe there's been a stay on the order. And so that means the judge is going to relook at it and decide whether or not the interpretation will stand. But regardless of where the legislation goes, we believe that there's been a shift in New York where it's become a lot more tenant friendly and more tenants' rights friendly. And I think landlords, regardless of whether or not they agree with it, they're seeing that there's a much better way to do things, a much more efficient way to do things. And really, for the most part, it's not going with brokers.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the future then, because it seems like this is the new normal right now across the country. We're seeing Fannie and Freddie relaxing restrictions on what kind of paperwork they need to get, and they're doing it digitally now. They're allowing digital inspections to be filed. There's a whole litany of things right now that we're seeing a shift. Yeah. And I think in many ways, this coronavirus pandemic has been the catalyst for a lot of these things. Appraisers, we saw it in the commercial space, certainly. Digital appraisers, and no one's becoming an appraiser anymore, right?
Right.
And so, no kid is going to college to become an appraiser. So that whole segment is going to be gone, I think, in the next few years. Those will be aged out. So do you think that this is the new normal? I mean, do you see you having to roll back any of the digital items here once we get out of this mess?
No, we've seen adoption go through the roof because even though the real estate agents and real estate for the most part has been declared an essential service, they're still advising against doing in-person showings. And so, frankly, if you're buying a home, for instance, or you're buying a condo, you're going to be there for the long haul experience. You need to go see the neighborhood, make sure that you know what your neighbors are going to be like inside the apartment building. You want to get a feel really because you may be there for the long haul. The odds are buying a home is going to be the largest purchase that an individual makes in their lifetime. When you're talking about an apartment, on average, apartment renters stay in their apartment for about 2 years. And so most leases are about a year. God forbid you make a wrong decision, you can get out of it relatively scot-free. So we found that with Doorkee's platform, which allows apartment seekers to find their apartment from an apartment's current tenant that's moving out at the end of their lease, we've connected the person who's going to move in with the person who is currently moving out. And what that allows is for virtual tours. So there doesn't need to be someone showing them the unit, actually keying them in. Instead, we added a new feature that allows people to take a video walkthrough, which has been incredibly popular. And then we also have a feature, a scheduling feature that allows people to do video chats through FaceTime or through Google Hangouts to be able to see the apartment. And for the most part, 2 to 3 minutes of video hangout is all that most apartment seekers need to feel comfortable applying to the unit. And now we've had a lot of landlords that have been skeptical about it. They've been skeptical about the tenant to tenant experience. They've been skeptical about the virtual experience. They've been skeptical about moving the entire signing, review, closing, payment process online. But the reality is, this appetite has been there from the apartment seekers and the departing tenants for, call it, at least the last decade. It's really just the landlords that have been behind the times, that have been reticent to adopt new technologies. And now that this is their only alternative because they can't do in-person showings, they can't do wet signings of contracts, they're kind of stuck up the creek here. And so Doorkee comes in and says, not only can we do all these things for you virtually, but we're going to save you a ton of money on vacancy, because instead of waiting for your apartment to become vacant, getting a broker, paying an expensive broker fee, and then absorbing on average a month of vacancy, we can eliminate that vacancy. We can cut that fee from over 8% to 5%, and we can do everything for you in one place: background check, lease signing, fund transfer, all digitally, which is not only a much better experience for everybody, but it's the only way that you can transact on apartments right now safely in New York City.
Right. You have no choice right now. If you want to move, you want to find a place, you've got
Right.
to go online. I mean, I would have loved that process when I lived in New York City, to be able to go online, find everything I needed, do a virtual tour. So I guess, how do you overcome some of those objections, right? Which is, okay, is what I'm seeing on this video really what's in this apartment? And are they showing me, are they hiding the fact that the closet door is not connected properly? So we didn't see that in the video. How thorough are these
Sure.
videos? What sort of pushback have you gotten from people, and how do you overcome those objections?
Yeah, the irony of that is if you go on apartment rental search platforms that are broader and have big name recognition, most of the postings are by brokers. And oftentimes, brokers take very flattering angles. They use fisheye lens to make the apartment look a lot better than it is. And they really don't know the apartment well because they're brokering dozens of apartments at a time. And they haven't lived there. They don't know what the experience is like. Instead, with Doorkee, you're getting the departing tenant who has lived in that apartment probably for a year, most likely more. They don't have a fisheye lens. They're not professionally trained on how to take deceiving photos. Instead, pretty much you get what is there. What you see is what you get. And a video does generally a much better job of giving you a sense of depth, of giving you what the lighting looks like, of giving you the overall feel of the apartment than photos do. And so not only are you getting a better of experience with the video, but you're also able to ask questions about the apartment and about the building from the person who knows it the best, someone who's actually lived there. And we found that one of the main value props beyond being an apartment seeker, saving money on a broker fee, being able to find your unit much further ahead of time, 2 to 3 months ahead of time. One of the biggest value props for these apartment seekers is that they get to actually interact with that departing tenant, ask what the neighbors are like, ask what the neighborhood's like, really get to know what it's like to live in that building. And so we found that not only is it cheaper and more efficient, but it's actually a much, much better experience for most of the tenants because on the departing tenant side, here's the kicker. If they give that early notice to their landlord, right? On average, we're getting almost 70 days notice, whereas most landlords usually only get 20 to 30 days. We're also closing almost 90% of we are able to do that closing, the departing tenant earns a rent refund of about $1,000 from their landlord. And so everybody's interests are aligned. Departing tenants get control back in the process. They get to earn a rent refund if there's a successful closing. Landlords are happy because they're able to save money on vacancy, advertising, and brokers' costs. And apartment seekers get to skip the broker fee and find their unit ahead of time. Now, most landlords may say, "I like my process as it is. I don't want to screw things up. There's no reason to, if it ain't broke, why fix it?" Well, our first answer is, it is definitely broke. You're just maybe not aware of how broken it is. There's a
Right.
lot of money being left on the table. But an easy way to sell this to a landlord is to say there's no opportunity cost. There's no money to get started with Doorkee. We make signing up an absolute breeze. If you have a property management system or a closing process that you love, we sync up with your back end. If you're a mom and pop landlord who doesn't have these lease signing or fund transfer or background check tools, we provide them for free to you. Oh, and you don't pay unless there's a closing. And so not only are you paying less than you would with a broker or in your current process, but you're still only paying if there's a successful closing. So really, there's no reason not to try out Doorkee.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, you've certainly found a need in the marketplace and solved a big pain point for a lot of people. So tell me, what's next for you guys? And as a company, where do you see things going over the course of this year, this crazy 2020?
Yeah, so 2020 is going to be very different than most years because in New York City and in a lot of cities that have the different climates, right? That have different seasons. So it may not be exactly the same for cities like Miami or cities like LA, but in cities like New York and Washington and Boston and Philly, it's highly cyclical, and so it's much more cyclical than a lot of other cities in the sense that almost everybody moves during the summer. So like June, July, August is really the heavy moving season. About 60% of all units that are turned over during the third quarter of a given year, which is really interesting because there actually used to be something called moving day that I believe happened in May in New York City. It was literally the one day that every single person moved apartments, which is insane. And so now we've spread moving day across the course of the summer. And what we're seeing is that
Wait a second. Wait a second.
typically
That was actually a thing. Like you could only
it
move
was a
on
thing.
this day.
You can only move on this day. I mean, it is absolute insanity. It's like one of those things that you maybe never learned about in school. I just found out a few months ago because Liv, our head of marketing, is working on doing or was working on doing a moving day experience. Except obviously, no one's allowed to be really outside anymore, so that went out the window. But look it up. Look up moving day in New York. It's fascinating. I believe it's like from the early 20th century. It's
Wow,
super super interesting.
that's
Yeah.
crazy. Sorry to
So
interrupt you.
now
I'd
instead of
never heard of that.
Yeah, no, a lot of people haven't. And so instead of there being one moving day, we really have like moving quarter, which is like, more or less like, June, July, August, like, end of Q2 towards the beginning and middle of Q3. And so these apartments, almost everyone's moving during that window. We've been seeing pre-COVID typically about a 60-40 split. 60% of our tenants tend to renew, 40% tend to leave. Now, over the course of the past month and a half, we've seen those numbers go from roughly 60-40 to more towards 70-30. It's more like 68-32. So if you think about it, it's really only been a relatively small change in how many people have decided that they're not going to move. And so we still have a lot of people who are optimistic about finding their next apartment in June, July, and August. And so we're getting notice from people. We're getting notice about 100 days out. I'm sorry, we're sending our renewal notices about 100 days out. We're getting answers back on average about 70 days out. And so people are still optimistic about moving. And frankly, they're able to find their apartment online. They'll be able to do a viewing online, do the whole process online. Now, what I think we're going to see differently is there are a lot of people whose leases were expiring in April, May, and June who weren't quite sure that what the situation was going to be with COVID. And so what they're trying to negotiate with their landlords is a short lease extension. So they eventually want to move out this year, right? Because people move because of lifestyle things. They got a new job. They want to live on their own. They want to live with a significant other. They're buying a home, right? So for the reasons that most people move are not necessarily because they don't like their current apartment, right, or their life anymore. So we're not seeing that dramatic of a shift of so many people just saying, I'm not going to move anymore. But what we're seeing is them pushing out the timeline to move. And so I think that instead of 60% of the people moving in a given year being around those summer months, it's going to look to tick up to probably 70 to 75% because of so many people slightly delaying their move, being hopeful about COVID being a little bit more under control over the summer. And so I think that that's where we'll see some changes in people moving's process.
And finally, well, let me get you out of here on this question, which is about rent. Certainly in the multifamily space, we've had a number of multifamily folks here on the show, Ken McElroy and others over the past week, talking about their experience right now, and some of their areas down about 20% in rental collections. Knock on wood, right now on the single family space, which I'm in, we've had about 100% collections, which has been amazing in the month of March so far. What about you guys? Where are you seeing that right now, rent collections in New York City for landlords?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's highly dependent upon the type of unit, highly dependent on the landlord. So, one of our investors and partners is Stonehenge. And I believe Ofer Yardeni, who's the CEO and chairman, he came out the other day and said that he didn't see any real major decrease in being able to accept rents. And so, a lot of it has to do with your tenants and what line of business they're in. And so, if you're talking about like upper middle market, for the most part, a lot of their tenants have not seen a decrease in wages, and so therefore are very comfortable about paying it. However, there's a ton of anxiety. The Salerno family in Williamsburg, where I grew up, actually just canceled rent for all of their tenants, all of their hundreds of tenants across their portfolio. And so we're beginning to see a mix of responses. Some landlords are saying there'll be no concessions, there'll be no delay, you have to pay rent on time. And we're seeing some landlords that say, take the month off or pay me a month later. I think that depending on your portfolio, whether it's in Manhattan or it's in one of the outer boroughs, it's highly dependent on the wage earning of your individual tenants. There have been some talks about a citywide rent strike, I believe one of the congresswomen from Queens just recommended, or I could be wrong on that, it may be Ilhan Omar, who just recommended or just put a bill on the floor of Congress around doing a mortgage and a rent pausing, where multifamily landlords can still eventually get that rent if they agree to certain very, very strict guidelines. I'm not optimistic that will pass, but I think that the conversation being opened around how can we make it so that these tenants are going to be able to pay their rent each month is something that's going to have to continue ongoing, because this diminishment in wages is not something that's going to let up in the next month. It's probably going to be over the course of the next 6 months to a year. And so I think that this is a rent crisis in waiting. And if we don't see our legislatures make a move for something dramatic soon, we're going to have a real problem in New York City through the summer.
Yeah, I agree. And around the country. Well, John, it's been a real treat having you here on the show. How can people connect with you and learn more?
Sure. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, John Fagan, Fagan. You can go to doorkee.com. That's 2 O's, 2 E's, no Y, DOORKEE.com. You can also email me. My email is john@doorkee.com. You can send me ideas. If you're a landlord in New York City, we found that when I do these webinars, we get a huge rush of traction. And so if you want to reach out, any of those options are great. You can also follow us, Doorkee, on Instagram. We do a really cool job of putting together fun memes. So if you love memes, which to be honest is between that and my dog Scouter is the only thing keeping me sane during COVID. Go check us out on Instagram.
Absolutely. Instagram and TikTok keep me alive these days. So awesome stuff, and our new dog too. John, it's been great getting
That's
to
right.
know you here on the show. Thank you so much, and also nice to get to know Scout a little bit too. Thanks for joining us on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having both of us, Clayton.
You bet. Thanks, John. And thanks to all of you for downloading and subscribing. We really appreciate it. It's some crazy times we're living in right now, but the future is here. Digital is here. And if you are not moving in that direction as a realtor, as a landlord, as a broker, you better get your head examined, because it's here. This is the new normal, right? This is like saying that the car is just a fad and I'm going to keep my horse and buggy. It's not going to happen. So that's today's show, everyone. We really appreciate it. Go out there, become a real estate investor. I believe it's the #1 way to build wealth. We'll see you next time.